On October 16, 2012, the police received a call from a crying woman who said that two men had attacked them in her home and were trying to kidnap them. Trying to defend themselves, they killed one of them. Nancy had always known she was different, though she couldn't quite put a name to it until she was in her teens. Growing up in a strict Orthodox family in a small religious town, her childhood was anything but carefree. Her parents, devout to the core, had raised her and her older brother Russell in the shadow of the church, where prayers replaced bedtime stories, and the words of the Bible were the only acceptable form of knowledge. From a young age, Nancy was taught that obedience was a virtue, and sin was something to be feared above all else. Any deviation from the narrow path set out by her parents was met with stern discipline and fervent prayers for her soul. It wasn't until she turned 16 that Nancy began to understand what set her apart. She realized she was attracted to girls, not boys. At first, it was a confusing and terrifying revelation. The teachings of the church had drilled into her that such feelings were unnatural, sinful even. But as the months passed, her feelings grew stronger, and she could no longer deny who she was. She kept her secret hidden, terrified of what her parents would do if they found out. Every day was a struggle between her true self and the mask she wore to please her family. But on her 18th birthday, the burden of hiding became too much to bear. In a moment of vulnerability, seeking acceptance and understanding, she confessed her truth to her parents. She told them she was a lesbian, hoping against hope that they would love her no matter what. Their reaction was swift and brutal. Instead of the support she had desperately craved, she was met with disgust and anger. Her mother wept as though she had died, and her father's face twisted with a rage she had never seen before. He accused her of bringing shame to their family, of turning her back on God. There was no compassion, no attempt to understand. They saw her as broken, something that needed to be fixed. The very next day, they dragged her to the church, where they sought the advice of the priest. They spoke of her as if she weren't there, discussing her as if she were some kind of lost sheep that had strayed too far from the flock. The priest, a man as rigid in his beliefs as her parents, suggested a radical solution. Nancy would become a nun. He assured them that the discipline and devotion required in the life of a nun would cleanse her soul and return her to the path of righteousness. It was, he said, the only way to save her. Nancy was horrified, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Her parents had made up their minds. They saw this as a form of penance, a way to force her back into the mold they had created for her. Without hesitation, they signed the necessary papers and handed her over to the church. From that day on, Nancy's life was no longer her own. She was stripped of her identity, her autonomy, and her freedom. The vibrant, spirited girl she had once been was buried beneath the weight of her new life. For the next 6 years, Nancy lived as a nun, bound by vows she had never wanted to take. Her days were a monotonous routine of prayers, chores, and more prayers. The rigid structure of her life was meant to cleanse her soul, but all it did was deepen her resentment. She had been forced into a life she loathed, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a sinner in need of saving. Though she pretended to conform, going through the motions with the blank expression expected of her, inside she seethed with anger and despair. She despised her parents for what they had done to her, for stealing away her youth and her freedom. But perhaps more than anything, she hated herself for not fighting harder, for allowing herself to be caged by their beliefs. No matter how hard she tried, she could not bring herself to believe as they did. She could not pray the feelings away, nor could she accept the idea that who she was at her core was something to be ashamed of. But she knew better than to voice these thoughts. Any hint of dissent would bring further punishment, further attempts to correct her. Russell had always been the golden child, the embodiment of everything his parents valued. Where Nancy was rebellious and questioning, Russell was obedient and devout. As the firstborn, he had been groomed from a young age to take on a significant role in the church. By the time he turned 20, He was already working alongside their father as his assistant in the very temple that would later become Nancy's prison. The temple was not just a place of worship for Russell. It was the core of his existence. His entire life revolved around the church, and he believed with every fiber of his being that the path he had chosen, or rather, the path chosen for him, was the only way to live a righteous life. He had no room for doubt, no patience for those who strayed from the teachings he held sacred. His was a world of black and white, of sinners and the saved, and he prided himself on being among the latter. When Nancy was forced into the convent, it was Russell who took on the role of her guardian. Their parents, trusting him implicitly, tasked him with ensuring that Nancy stayed on the path of righteousness. They believed that under his watchful eye, she would be reformed, her sinful desires purged through the discipline of the church. Russell, too, believed this. He saw it as his duty not just as a brother, but as a servant of God, to oversee her transformation. But for Nancy, Russell was not a brother in any true sense of the word. He was her warden, her jailer. From the moment she was taken to the temple, Russell was always there, watching, judging, ensuring she adhered to the strict rules laid out for her. The monotony of her existence was slowly eating away at her. Each day, she felt a little piece of herself slip away, lost to the relentless march of time in this place. She hated the nuns, the monks, the prayers, and the rituals. But then, one day, something changed. The day began like any other, with the usual morning prayer and a list of chores that stretched on for hours. But in the afternoon, the temple received an unexpected visitor. Nancy first noticed the murmur of excitement among the other nuns, a rare occurrence in this place of quiet obedience. Word quickly spread that an activist had come to speak with them, a woman who had once been a nun herself. The news was met with mixed reactions: curiosity, fear, and a hint of resentment. But for Nancy, it was something else entirely. It was a spark of hope. The activist's name was Stacy, a woman who had once walked the same paths as Nancy, worn the same robes, and endured the same life. But unlike Nancy, Stacy had escaped. She had found a way out and had dedicated her life to exposing the injustices that took place within these walls. She knew firsthand what it was like to be trapped, and she had made it her mission to help others like Nancy. Before Stacy arrived, they were given strict instructions on how to conduct themselves during the visit. The head priest, a man as stern as he was pious, warned them not to stray from the script. They were to present themselves as content, devout servants of God, to lie if necessary about the conditions in which they lived. The temple's reputation was at stake, and any deviation from the narrative could have severe consequences. And then Stacy entered the room. Nancy's breath caught in her throat. Stacy was not at all what she had expected. She was tall, with striking red hair that cascaded down her back, a stark contrast to the muted colors of the temple. Her eyes were bright, full of life and intelligence, and she carried herself with a confidence that seemed to defy the very walls around her. But it was her smile that truly captivated Nancy. It was warm, genuine, a beacon of light in the cold, oppressive space of the temple. The temple was a place of secrets and surveillance, and she had to be careful. As Stacy's visit drew to a close, Nancy knew she had to act quickly. As the nuns and monks began to disperse, Nancy saw her opportunity. She waited until her brother's back was turned, his attention momentarily distracted by the head priest. Then, with a burst of courage she didn't know she had, she slipped away from the group and ran after Stacy, catching her just as she was about to leave. "Wait," Nancy whispered urgently, her heart pounding in her chest. "I need to talk to you." Stacy turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I can't talk here," Nancy stammered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "But I have information, things you need to know. Please, come to the garden after 10 p.m., to the statue on the other side of the fence. I'll meet you there." Stacy hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be there," she promised. Her voice was low and serious. Next day, when the bells finally tolled 10 p.m., signaling the end of the day's activities, Nancy waited until the sounds of movement in the hallways died down, replaced by the soft murmurs of the other nuns preparing for bed. She could hear the faint snores of the older women, the creak of floorboards as the last few stragglers made their way to their rooms. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay still, waiting for the right moment. Finally, when she was certain the temple had settled into its nightly silence, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. She had to be careful. Any noise could bring someone to investigate, and the last thing she needed was to be caught sneaking out. Moving as quietly as she could, Nancy reached for the handle of her door and slowly eased it open, wincing at the faint creak it made. She paused, listening for any signs that someone had heard, but the temple remained silent. Nancy stepped into the corridor, her heart racing. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flickering candle mounted on the walls. She moved swiftly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the cold stone floor. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, incense, and dampness. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light, her breath coming in short, nervous bursts. As she approached the end of the corridor, she saw the figure of the night guard slumped in a chair, fast asleep. His snores echoed softly through the hall, and for a moment, Nancy froze, her breath catching in her throat. If he woke up now, it would all be over. She waited, watching him carefully, but he didn't stir. Taking a deep breath, she darted past him, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the statue, she saw a figure standing on the other side of the fence. Stacy was there, just as she had promised, her face barely visible in the dim light. Nancy felt a surge of relief and fear at the same time. She ran to the fence, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could barely hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. Nancy took a deep breath, steadying herself. The words came tumbling out in a rush, each one heavy with the pain and anger she had kept bottled up for so long. She told Stacy everything, how her parents had forced her into this life, how her brother had watched over her like a prison guard, how she had spent the last 5 years suffocating under the weight of the temple's expectations. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her chest, the burden of her secrets finally being shared. Stacy listened intently, her eyes never leaving Nancy's face. As Nancy recounted her story, Stacy's expression softened, a look of deep understanding and empathy settling over her features. She had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from Nancy, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it all the more real. When Nancy finished, she reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It was her secret diary, the one place where she had been able to pour out her true thoughts and feelings, hidden away from prying eyes. She handed it to Stacy through the bars of the fence, her hand trembling slightly. "Take this," Nancy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has everything, every thought, every experience, every moment of fear and anger. I've been writing in it since the day I arrived. If something happens to me, I want someone to know the truth." Next day, Nancy tried to lose herself in the work, scrubbing floors and polishing wooden pews, anything to distract her from the gnawing fear in her chest. But the sense of being watched lingered, a constant, oppressive presence that she couldn't shake. It wasn't until the afternoon that her fear began to take a more tangible form. As she was tending to the overgrown flower beds in the garden, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Turning slowly, she saw Russell walking toward her, his expression calm but with an unsettling intensity in his eyes. There was something different about him, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. He stopped close to her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a physical weight. Russell began to speak, his tone measured and almost patronizing. He spoke of how proud he was of her progress, how it seemed that the temple's influence was finally taking hold. He mentioned how he would be sure to tell their parents about her apparent transformation, how they would be pleased to know she was on the right path. As he spoke, Nancy felt her heart sink. His words were laced with a subtle menace, a cold undercurrent that hinted at something more sinister. It became clear to her that he knew something, or at least suspected it. But instead of confronting her directly, he was playing a game, testing her, watching for any sign of weakness. After a few more veiled comments, he finally left, but not before giving her one last look that sent a chill down her spine. As soon as he was gone, Nancy collapsed to her knees in the garden, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had never felt so terrified in her life. The fear that Russell knew, that he was merely toying with her, was overwhelming. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety, every moment a struggle to keep her fear at bay. She went through the motions of her duties, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed with thoughts of her brother and what he might do. That night, as the temple settled into its usual silence, Nancy prepared to meet Stacy again. This time, however, every step she took was fraught with a heightened sense of danger. The corridors seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if they were conspiring to reveal her secrets. She moved cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest, every creak of the floorboards making her flinch. When she finally reached the garden, the air was thick with tension. The night was eerily quiet, the wind having died down, leaving only the rustle of leaves to break the silence. Nancy approached the fence, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of Stacy. For a moment, she feared Stacy might not have come, that perhaps the danger was too great. But then she saw a figure standing on the other side, the faint glow of moonlight illuminating Stacy's red hair. Stacy was prepared, holding a thick blanket, which she quickly threw over the barbed wire at the top of the fence. Urgency radiated from her as she signaled for Nancy to climb over. Nancy's heart raced as she grabbed the fence and began to pull herself up, the cold metal biting into her hands. She was almost over when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Emerging from the shadows, Russell appeared, his face twisted with anger. He lunged forward, grabbing her leg and trying to pull her back down. Panic surged through Nancy, and she fought back, kicking with all her strength. Her foot connected with his face, and she felt a sickening crunch as his nose broke. Blood poured down his face, but he didn't relent. His grip tightened, and Nancy's heart pounded in her ears as she struggled to free herself. In those terrifying moments, everything seemed to slow down. Stacy was on the other side of the fence, desperately trying to help, but the distance felt insurmountable. With a final burst of strength, Nancy managed to kick Russell hard enough to loosen his grip. She scrambled over the fence, landing hard on the other side, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. Stacy quickly pulled her to her feet, and without a word, they ran, the sound of Russell's enraged shouts echoing behind them. They didn't stop until they were far from the temple, the dark silhouette of the building barely visible in the distance. Nancy collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and tears streamed down her face. She was incredibly scared that her brother would find her, that her parents would find out, and what they would do after that. It was unbearable. Stacy suggested they go back to her apartment, a small, modest place on the other side of the city. It was a risk, but it was their only option. When they finally reached Stacy's apartment, Nancy felt a small measure of relief. The building was old but well kept, with narrow hallways and creaky stairs. Stacy unlocked the door to her apartment and ushered Nancy inside, quickly locking it behind them. The space was small but cozy, with warm lighting and simple furnishings. It felt safe, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the temple. Once inside, Nancy finally allowed herself to collapse onto the worn sofa, her body sinking into the cushions as if she could melt away from the stress and fear. Stacy hurried to get her a glass of water, and as Nancy drank, she felt some of the tension begin to ease, though it was far from gone. As Nancy's breathing began to steady, Stacy suggested they change out of their clothes. Nancy was still in her nun's habit, a stark reminder of everything they were trying to escape. Stacy led her to the small bedroom, where she pulled out some of her own clothes for Nancy to wear. The clothes were simple but comfortable, jeans, and a loose-fitting shirt, a world away from the restrictive habit she had worn for so long. Nancy hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything making her movements slow and deliberate. She slipped out of the habit, feeling a strange mix of emotions as she let the fabric fall to the floor. Stacy returned to the room, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. The tension between them was palpable, not just from the fear, but from the unspoken connection that had been growing between them since they first met. Stacy stepped closer, her hand gently brushing against Nancy's arm. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, of comfort, of solidarity, of something deeper that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. In that moment, the weight of everything became too much for Nancy to bear. She broke down, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. Stacy immediately wrapped her arms around Nancy, holding her tightly as she sobbed into her shoulder. They started kissing. They spent this terrible night in Stacy's room. Nancy is finally free. She is in love with Stacy. Their night was very passionate, but they could not expect what would happen tomorrow. The next day dawned, but Nancy found no peace in the morning light. Having slept in a strange new place, her dreams had been plagued by the familiar horrors of her past. Visions of her parents and her brother Russell, their faces twisted with anger and condemnation. Stacy noticed Nancy's distress and suggested that she stay home to rest, while Stacy took care of the day's errands. Determined to create some sense of normalcy, Stacy decided she would go to the store and pick up groceries so she could cook them a nice meal. Despite Nancy's reluctance, Stacy reassured her that everything would be fine. She got dressed and headed out the door, leaving Nancy alone in the apartment. Barely a minute had passed when Nancy's worst fears were realized. From outside, she heard Stacy scream, her voice filled with terror. "Run, run as fast as you can." Stacy's words were like a jolt of electricity, snapping Nancy into action. Without thinking, she darted towards the back door, desperate to reach Stacy and understand what was happening. As Nancy flung open the back door, she was immediately overpowered. A massive figure blocked her path. Steve, her brother's friend, and the second assistant priest at the temple. Steve was even larger and more intimidating in person, his strength evident as he effortlessly lifted Nancy off the ground. His grip was vice-like, and his expression was one of cold determination. Steve's voice was eerily calm as he questioned why she was trying to escape. He assured her that everything would be fine once they returned to the church, that all would be forgiven. His words were laced with a twisted sense of righteousness, as though he genuinely believed he was doing God's work by dragging her back into captivity. Nancy's heart raced with fear and anger. The thought of returning to the temple was unbearable, but what terrified her even more was the thought of what might have happened to Stacy. She struggled against Steve's hold, but his strength was overwhelming. Panic surged through her as she realized how dire the situation had become. Frantically, Nancy looked around, desperate for any sign of Stacy. Her eyes landed on the front door of the apartment, which was now open. And there, stepping out with a look of triumph, was Russell. He had Stacy in his grasp, his hand clamped tightly over her mouth to stifle her screams. Stacy's eyes were wide with fear as she struggled, but Russell's grip was unyielding. Russell's voice rang out, cold and filled with menace, as he began berating Nancy. He warned her not to do anything foolish, his tone dripping with condescension. He reminded her that he was only fulfilling their parents' wishes, ensuring that she returned to the path of righteousness. But underneath his words was a clear threat, one that made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to hurt Stacy if Nancy didn't comply. He said he followed Nancy after their first meeting. He knew that this would happen and was ready for it. The tension in the air was thick as Nancy faced the reality of the situation. Steve's iron grip on her was relentless, and Russell's hold on Stacy made her heart pound with fear. Nancy could see the cold determination in her brother's eyes. He would stop at nothing to drag them back into the nightmare they had just escaped. The odds were stacked against them, but the sheer desperation in Nancy's heart fueled a surge of adrenaline that sharpened her senses and steeled her resolve. In the briefest of moments, as Steve shifted his grip, Nancy felt a slight loosening of his hold. Without hesitation, she took advantage of this fleeting opportunity. Summoning every ounce of strength and courage she could muster, Nancy thrust her hand up toward Steve's face, her fingers jabbing into his eye with all her might. The action was swift, brutal, and born out of pure survival instinct. Steve roared in pain, his grip on Nancy weakening as he clutched his injured eye. Nancy didn't waste a second. She broke free from his grasp and lunged toward the kitchen counter where she had spotted a knife earlier. Her movements were frantic, driven by the primal need to protect herself and Stacy. She seized the knife, feeling the cold steel in her hand, and turned to face Russell, who was now trying to pull Stacy toward the door. Russell, seeing Nancy armed and desperate, made a move toward her, but his confidence betrayed him. In the chaos of the moment, Nancy's fear transformed into a wild, reckless determination. As Russell reached out to grab her, Nancy thrust the knife forward in a panic, the blade sinking deep into his abdomen. Time seemed to slow as Nancy realized what she had done. The knife, buried in Russell's stomach, was slick with blood, the crimson liquid beginning to pool and drip onto the floor. Russell's face twisted in shock and pain as he staggered backward, his hands instinctively moving to the wound. He collapsed to the floor, his strength rapidly fading as blood loss took its toll. Steve, still clutching his injured eye, screamed in disbelief and horror as he watched his friend fall. His shock quickly turned to anger as he rushed toward Nancy, but his movements were clumsy, hampered by his pain and the sight of Russell's injury. Stacy, now free from Russell's grip, scrambled to the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed emergency services. The panic in her voice was palpable as she explained the situation, how they had been attacked and that Russell had been stabbed in self-defense. Her words were frantic but clear, and the urgency in her tone left no room for doubt. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but even as Stacy relayed this information, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Nancy stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, as she watched her brother bleed out on the floor. The enormity of her actions weighed heavily on her, the realization that she had just taken a life, even in self-defense, overwhelming her. She felt numb, detached from the chaotic scene around her, as if she were watching it unfold from a distance. But there was no time to process what had happened. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling the approach of the authorities. Stacy rushed to Nancy's side, pulling the knife from her hand and tossing it aside before wrapping her arms around her. The two women clung to each other, both shaken and terrified, as they waited for the inevitable arrival of the police. Nancy's heart sank as she was pushed into the back of the police car, the weight of her father's words crushing her spirit. But as the car door closed, she saw Stacy being led to another vehicle, and their eyes met through the glass. In that brief moment, despite everything that had happened, there was a glimmer of hope, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. Nancy sat in a small interrogation room, her hands still shaking from the shock of it all. The blood on her clothes was a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted just hours earlier. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. But the more she thought about it, the more surreal it all seemed. It was as if the world she knew had been torn apart, leaving her in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The door to the room opened, and two detectives walked in. Their expressions were grim, their questions probing and relentless. They wanted to know every detail, how things had escalated, why she had resorted to violence, and whether there had been any other way to resolve the situation. Nancy answered as best she could, her voice trembling as she recounted the horror of the past few days. She tried to explain the fear, the desperation, the sense that she had no other choice. But the detectives remained impassive, their faces giving nothing away. After what felt like hours, they finally left her alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of activity elsewhere in the station. Nancy slumped in her chair, exhausted and emotionally drained. She knew that her life would never be the same again, that what had happened would leave scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. Meanwhile, Stacy was in another room, being questioned by a different set of officers. Her story corroborated Nancy's, but there was still a long road ahead. As they waited, the news of what had happened spread quickly. Nancy's parents arrived at the station, their faces etched with grief and anger. Her mother was inconsolable, sobbing uncontrollably as she tried to come to terms with the loss of her son and the actions of her daughter. Her father, on the other hand, was livid, his rage directed squarely at Nancy. He lashed out verbally, calling her every name in the book, blaming her for everything that had happened. He ranted about how she had brought shame on the family, how she had destroyed everything they had worked for. His words were cruel, intended to wound, and they did. But Stacy, who was sitting nearby, had had enough. She could no longer stand by and listen to the venomous accusations being hurled at Nancy. She stood up and faced Nancy's parents, her voice steady and full of righteous anger. She told them exactly what she thought, that they were the ones to blame for all of this, that their obsession with religious purity had driven Nancy to the brink, that they had created this nightmare by refusing to accept their daughter or who she was. Stacy's words cut through the tension like a knife, leaving Nancy's parents stunned into silence. In the end, the court ruled in Nancy's favor. The evidence clearly showed that she had been acting out of self-defense, and the charges were reduced. Nancy was sentenced to 6 months in prison for exceeding the boundaries of self-defense, with mandatory psychotherapy to address the trauma she had endured. It was a bittersweet victory. Freedom came with a price, but it was a price they were willing to pay to put this chapter of their lives behind them. Steve, who had assisted in the attempted abduction, was sentenced to 9 months in prison for his role in the attack. His involvement, along with the testimony of Stacy and others, painted a damning picture of the religious extremism that had fueled the events. It was a small measure of justice, but it brought some closure to the ordeal. Throughout Nancy's imprisonment, Stacy visited her regularly. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness. Stacy supported Nancy through the difficult process of healing, helping her come to terms with what had happened and guiding her through the therapy sessions that followed. When Nancy was finally released, Stacy was there to greet her, a wide smile on her face and tears of joy in her eyes. They embraced tightly, the weight of the past finally lifting as they walked out of the prison together. The future was still uncertain, but they knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything.